individual roles and responsibilities, so that you can minimize misunderstandings, because that's the last thing you want with your client. They provide your legal framework in terms of how you resolve a dispute if there is one, and basically reduce your risk in your business. And I think most importantly, they show your professionalism. They build trust and reliability and credibility with you and your customers. So they're a vital business tool, and I think understanding and sharing your own agreement with your client protects you and shows that you have a healthy professional client engagement. And I think that sort of sets us up for my next slide in terms of whether or not you have your own agreement as opposed to the client's contract. We often get some pushback from the smaller companies to say, well, what's the point of actually going to the cost and expense of drafting our own agreement, because the client generally wants us to sign theirs. It's really important for various reasons. Where the client's signing his own agreement, the client's prioritizing their business needs and their business interests. Where you have your agreement that you put together and put forward to your client, obviously those protect and reflect your own preferred terms and your business interests. The client contract is going to have key features around strict penalties and limitations of liabilities, which are terribly onerous on you as a service provider, whereas your agreement is going to set your boundaries and your responsibilities, and you're going to, for example, deal with your payment terms obligations. You're going to deal with payment provisions that suit your business, as opposed to that which suits the customer. And I think one of the difficult things that we also find is from a negotiation perspective. You're going to get your client contract, they're going to have terribly onerous provisions. It's then going to be up to you to then maybe employ or get a lawyer involved to have a look to make sure that that client is actually fair and in your interest and favor as well. And if you provide your contract to the customer, for example, you have a good starting point from a negotiation perspective. So the advice today is to see if you can't maybe put together your own agreement, whether or not it's a 1 or 2 pager, but at a minimum, let's have some terms and conditions that protect you and your business interests in terms of what's going to work for you. So basically, the purpose of today's webinar, I thought what we should deal with is we'll deal with 7 pitfalls for you to be aware of in a contract. I'm going to chat about the parties to a contract, payment terms, non-solicitation, limitation of liability, which is always a fun one, change procedures, intellectual property, and signing. So the parties. So I think we all know that there have to be at least 2 juristic persons in terms of a contract. You cannot contract with oneself. So we deal with various entities. You will sign with another company, for example. We have various companies, those that offer its share to the public. Those are listed on the stock exchange. They generally end with XYZ Limited. And an interesting fact is that their registration number always ends with a 06. You will then get a private company that doesn't offer its shares. I suppose we're all those on the stock exchange. They will always end with a PTY Limited, and their number will always end with a 07. And then you get state-owned companies like Eskom, SOC. You will also enter into agreements with individuals. You need to please make sure that that individual is 18 years or older, or an emancipated minor, and that when you're entering into an agreement with an individual, that individual is not under an insolvency order. They don't have the rights to contract. You would also potentially enter into an agreement with a partner. We need to have a chat if you do so. You need to understand that if you enter into a partnership, that generally a partner can bind the other partners to a partnership. So you always need to be quite wary of that. And the other type of entities that you would enter into agreements with are your government entities, provincial, local authorities. The things that you need to be aware of from a party perspective is to make sure when you're contracting that you have the correct legal entity that you're dealing with. Sometimes organizations have various subsidiaries. Make sure that the entity that you're contracting with and providing the services to is the correct entity on your contract, that you in fact have the correct registration number. And then also the domicilium address. And this is particularly relevant from a litigation perspective. And we're finding it's quite difficult to serve papers if you don't have the correct address of the legal entity. Sometimes the address on your contract is potentially a dormant address, or the company doesn't exist. That then just causes great delays in terms of trying to serve your papers if you need to litigate. Also need to please make sure that when the party is signing, that the person actually has the authority to sign your contract. A question could be is how you're going to verify this type of information. You would request copies of their SIP-C documentation. Those would set out the correct legal details for you. And also from a signatory perspective, you could ask for a copy of the board resolution authorizing that person to sign. The next really important thing I'd like to stress, and I think we are most impacted by that as an SMME group, is payment terms. If we don't have properly addressed payment terms, or they are vague, or in fact unaddressed at all, we find that the clients are not paying us on time. It affects our cash flow, and obviously then affects our business viability. What I've done in the slide, in a couple of the slides, is I have given examples of proposed terms that we should have in terms of our contracts. For example, all invoices shall be paid by the customer within 30 days of the date of the service provider's invoice. What I'm trying to say there, and what's really important, is that we must have a period by when they need to pay. You need to decide what works for you from a cash flow perspective, from your business perspective. It might be that 30 days is too late for you. You might want to negotiate 7-day payment terms. Good luck with that with a lot of the customers. But what's really important to note also is that make sure the contract says from the date of your invoice. What most contracts say is date of receipt of the invoice. That makes it very easy for the other side to say, well, they never in fact received it. And then that obviously delays your ability to get paid timeously. Other things that you should make sure you have in your payment terms, or in a contract that you negotiate, is the ability to charge interest on late payment. The other one, which is the most beneficial to you from a service provider perspective, is to have the right to suspend the services if you're not paid on time. This is a fabulous carrot to have, because obviously the client is impacted if you're not providing services. What I do suggest you do, as opposed to just summarily suspending the services, that you give the client another notice to say, if you don't pay me because you're already late, that if you don't pay me now within 5 business days, I'm actually going to suspend the services until such time as you do pay me. These are just a couple of additional examples of how you can make sure that you're going to get paid in time. Please don't agree to the application of set off. A lot of customers will have that they have the right to set off in an agreement. What that basically means is that if you, for example, negotiate an SLA or a penalty credit in terms of your agreement, where the customer feels that he is entitled, or it is entitled to that credit or that penalty because you haven't performed, the client's just simply going to say, I owe you X amount for services rendered, but you in fact owe me Y amount for the penalty, and therefore I'm only going to pay you the difference between the two. The problem with something like that is you may absolutely not feel that you have done anything wrong, that the client is entitled to that penalty, and then it becomes a whole question of you have to go and argue to get your money back. So try and do not agree to the application of set off, and also to the withholding of payment in your agreements. This is very difficult sometimes, especially in the construction industry, where your clients are going to want to have a retention fee of 10 or 15% of the purchase of the fee charged. But generally this becomes quite difficult if your client has the ability to withhold payment. they're going to try and do their damnness to make sure that they don't have to pay you that. And then it becomes your responsibility to have to prove that you're actually entitled to the money that they have in fact withheld.
Can we take a quick question, please?
Yes, of course.
There's a question from Izan, and she's asking, the question is, what is one's rights when payment terms are not met? What recourse do we have?
So it would be a breach. So what we would do is we would generally draft in your breach clause that non-payment would be deemed a material breach of your contract. That then gives you the ability to actually cancel the agreement and claim damages from your client if you haven't received payment. So we would make sure that you have it covered in your breach clause and make sure that payment is material to the agreement. I'm not sure are you comfortable, Izan?
I think the question as well is, I think often as a small business, we also don't want to damage the relationship, because often it's accounts that's not paying, but your relationship with the person that's receiving the service is actually really good. So you don't want to damage that. Do you have any advice maybe on how you can kind of deal with these things without breaking that relationship?
So that's so important in terms of what you're saying, and I have a summary around that at the end, but it is around if you have the right payment terms upfront negotiated, it becomes very much easier to say to your customer, listen, we did agree to this, as opposed to not having anything in there at all. So if you have the right payment terms, the negotiation and discussion becomes a little bit easier. It is very difficult. Often we're dealing with customers that we're dealing with large organizations. You're just something really small, and they misunderstand how the impact of not paying us affects our viability. But yeah, Almarie, that's really what I'm trying to say in terms of contract properly from the very beginning. It makes the discussions when non-payment takes place a whole lot easier.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Sure. The next thing I want to chat about, and this is always a very interesting one, is a non-solicitation clause. And why it's so interesting is that more often than not, your client contract doesn't have a non-solicitation clause in it. The reason for that is because they generally would like to poach and take your people. You're the service provider, so you are providing a service that they require. If they get to the point that they actually get on well with your person or with you, they want to have the ability to actually take that individual. So you need to please make sure that if you're dealing with a client contract, that you always, or your contract, that you always have a non-solicitation clause in there. It protects business relationships so that they can't take your people or your employees. It also preserves your competitive advantage because you and your people have all your IP, they have your business strategies, your trade secrets. Now your client's going to take that, or anybody's going to take that person, and you're going to lose that competitive advantage. By maintaining your staff, it keeps your business stable. And then one of the really important ones is it ensures contract performance, because what generally would happen is you agree to provide a specific service. You think that you've got 5 people on your books that are providing those services. Suddenly 2 or 3 of those people are taken away. It affects your ability to provide your service. You then are in breach of an SLA, or you are in breach of the actual agreement. And then you have a whole additional issue around your performance in terms of your agreement. So I'm also happy for you, Almarie, at the end of this to share the presentation, because what I've done is I've given examples of clauses in most of the 7 pitfalls. So for example, here I say that you must make sure that your non-solicitation clause protects you during the agreement, but also for a period after your agreement. So you want to make sure, some people negotiate up to 24 months. I think 12 months is more reasonable. And basically that the customer won't, during or after the period, employ any of your staff that I generally think that it's fair to say that we're involved in the implementation or execution of the agreement, and not just too random that it just is everybody. But you can decide which way you'd like to negotiate that. Another question that I often get asked is, and that we've seen in agreements, is what about payment options? So you have a non-solicitation clause, and then you have, notwithstanding the provisions above, if you do want to take any of our people, you have to pay 50% of their gross annual salary, or 100%, or whatever the parties may negotiate. I generally don't like this. I think we should steer away from this. I think having payment options in it allows your client an opportunity to still take potentially one of your really key people. Oh, this is the one that makes the lawyers very rich, and is generally the one that is the last issue in the contract to be finally negotiated, and it's the limitation of liability clause. If we don't have one, if it is misunderstood or very badly drafted, a limitation of liability clause can have catastrophic financial consequences. They could potentially shut us down, and also some of the liability clauses that you think you have negotiated may not potentially stand up in court. Those in particular are, for example, you can't contract out of liability for fraud. You can't contract out of liability for gross negligence or willful misconduct. A lot of the time we think we can, and we think we're protected in terms of that. You may not contract out of that legally. And I think it's really important to understand that even if you have a contract, you cannot contract out of the law. I think so often that too many of us either sign generic terms, which are highly one-sided, and we get very badly bullied by the customer to make sure that we sign very one-sided liability clauses. I want to just explain the difference between direct damages and indirect damages. These are the two paramounts in terms of your liability clauses. Direct damages generally relate directly to the breach or the wrongdoing. So they directly relate to the harm or loss suffered from that damage that's caused. I've given an example. So where you buy a machine and it breaks down on delivery, the direct damage to that is the cost of repair of that particular machine. What we need to do is understand that we would generally be liable for some form of damage. What we need to do, however, is make sure that we cap that liability, that we don't accept direct damages at any cost. So an example of the clause that I propose is that we say, notwithstanding the form, the maximum liability to compensate the customer for direct damage arising out of the agreement in this instance won't exceed the amount of total fees already paid by the customer to you. This is quite a sneaky one, but generally we can get away with that if we're lucky. But basically, if you would already have received the money, so it seems to be a fair way to say, well, it's in your favor if you can say that you've already paid the money. Alternatively, we can agree that it is that your direct damages liability won't exceed the actual fee that you have proposed to the customer and which has been agreed. Some of the times a limitation of liability could be a monetary value. You could agree on a 20,000, 50,000, a million rand cap on your liability. Please, I need you to be aware, don't agree to a cap on liability that is any higher than the value for which you are insured. Okay, and then we get to the difference between the two. So indirect or consequential damages are the losses that are suffered as an indirect result of that damage. So for example, that would be loss of business reputation, loss of future business opportunities. In my example of the broken machine, so now your machine is broken, the fact that your business cannot continue because that machine is broken and that you're going to lose money as a result thereof is an indirect damage. We need to make sure that we, at every single opportunity, exclude liability for indirect or consequential losses. what I've done in my proposed clause for you is said that in no event will you be liable for indirect, incidental, special, consequential damage. And I've said further in brackets that that includes loss of profit, loss of reputation, loss of goodwill. One of the things that I also think we need to be very aware of is I include loss of damage to data or software. This is always a very contentious issue because what is breach of data and breach of confidentiality? What are they regarded as? They are generally regarded as indirect or consequential losses. Those are losses that are suffered as a result of the wrongdoing. The problem for us today, and rightfully so, I think, is that the customers are pushing back greatly and are expecting you to have some form of liability for where you breach their data or you breach their confidentiality. What I generally would agree or propose is that we say that notwithstanding the indirect consequential, we agree that we would be liable for breach of, only if the customer insists, on breach of data or breach of confidentiality. But then we make sure that that liability is capped. And what I generally propose is if you generally cap your direct damages at, for example, the value of your fee charged, I would propose that if we are liable for breach of data and confidentiality, that might be, your cap might then be 3 times the value of your service fee charge, so that the customer has some comfort in the fact that you're taking breach of data or confidentiality seriously by accepting a higher cap on liability. But we must at all times make sure that our liability is capped. So often we get a customer's agreement, the customer makes sure that they cap their liability, but then it is silent in terms of the service provider's liability. Thank you. I'm surprised there are no questions with regards to this one, because this is always a really contentious one.
So actually, there are a few questions, but
Okay.
it's actually going back to the payment. So shall we just deal with those?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So let me just get to them. So there's a question from Z. He's saying, what is the impact of not necessarily having the payment terms covered in the contract, but rather included as terms and conditions in the invoice itself?
Oh, that's a really great question. The problem is, a lot of the time your contract will say that notwithstanding your terms and provisions or any terms and conditions that you have in your quote, the contract overrides. The contract will override anything. You also will have sometimes we call them boilerplate clauses. It's all those lovely fun clauses at the end which talks to jurisdiction and things like that. There will be a clause in there that says, notwithstanding anything else that the parties might have provided or discussed before, the terms and provisions of this contract will override. So if you don't have any payment provisions in your agreement and you have a quote, I would say that you could argue that you have terms and conditions and those would apply, but it would be very difficult to prove if you have an agreement, because generally your agreement would override those terms.
Thank you. Then the next question that we have is, what is this? This is from Cheryl Ann. What suggestion is a fair time frame when the interest percentage on the outstanding amount can kick in?
I would say that it's fair from the date that they are in breach. So if you have a payment term that says they need to pay you within 30 days, your interest can kick in from day 31. Because why should it not? They're in breach of the terms. They have and I think it's really important to remember they've agreed to your payment terms. If you have a signed agreement and you've got your 30 days, the client has looked at it. It's the intention of both parties that you'll be paid by then. So your interest would start from day 31.
Thank you. And then there's a question from Garth. How do you negotiate around milestone payments where the client wants to hold 15% of each invoice? Is one in a position to negotiate the percentage of the invoices?
100%. And I think, Garth, it's really important to remember you are in a position to negotiate anything. And I think often we get nervous because we really want the work, but the customer bullies us. And I think you must always just remember that the client wants what you are offering. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in discussions with them. And I think we often forget that. So we should show up, negotiate what it is that you are comfortable to negotiate. Milestone payments in particular are relevant from a project perspective. So we'll find that when we're providing project services, milestone payments are the norm. But what that percentage it would be, I think it also makes a difference in terms of how important is that phase of the project. You might have a really important section of your project which is the majority of it. Your milestone is going to be your milestone payment obviously would be higher with regards to that. But yeah, you need to negotiate it whatever you're comfortable with.
Thank you very much. And then the last one is from Jay. She's saying POPIA is also normally mentioned, and we need to ensure that we have done all we can to prevent data breaches. And I think this is also, if there's a data breach around the liability there.
Absolutely. Hi, Jay. It was lovely to see your name. Yeah, I'm not going to touch on POPIA today in terms of one of the points, but yeah, we would have comprehensive data protection clauses. We could potentially do that at another stage. But yes, you're absolutely correct. Data is something that is really important to the customers, and that's why we just need to make sure that we protect ourselves in terms of the necessary contract clauses to make sure that we comply, but also that the client complies in terms of its obligations from a data perspective.
Yeah, and Josh is also making a very valid point. In many instances, the organizations are large, so it's a kind of a take it or leave it kind of contract. I know in many instances, even when they send out the request for the RFPs, request for proposals, or the tenders, that they also include the contract already. So you actually don't. So he's asking, what are the mechanisms to amend or suggest changes suitable to the SMME?
So I think when we're talking government contract, it is very difficult, but I think we need to bear in mind, you cannot change the GCCs, so the general conditions of contract, but you always have the ability to negotiate the special conditions of contract. And I hear you in terms of a lot of the time the customer says, if you're going to make any changes to this, you're going to be automatically disqualified. I think we then need to understand what our contractual obligations are and decide whether or not that's going to work for us from a business perspective. Because if you understand, for example, that you're going to get a contract where you have terrible limitation of liability obligations, what can we put in place within our organizations to make sure that we safeguard those? So there are going to be some opportunities or some times where we're going to have to sign on the dotted line with things that make us feel uncomfortable, but then we need to just really understand what those are and make sure that the people that are providing the services within our organizations understand those too and the implications of a breach, and then put in some safeguards. It's not ideal, but sometimes we're going to have to sign stuff we don't necessarily want to. But the idea behind today's masterclass is to highlight things for you to be aware of. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, there was a comment here from Gabedi, around how unfair the contracts very often is to small businesses. But I think it comes back to what you're saying is you need to be aware. And in the end, I guess the advice is if it's not good for your business, then don't contract with that company, because we're all here to make money. And if the contract's unfair to you, if it puts your business at risk, then you have to make the choice to rather walk away.
Absolutely. And that's what I started with. We cannot do business at any cost. And it is very difficult. And I think so often, especially the large organizations, they understand that we are on the back foot. But I think, as I said earlier, they want you. Stand up for stand up for what you believe in and what you believe your worth is. But we can always do it in a way that's really professional and, that we come across correctly. And a lot of the time, they respect that. And I was going to say it a little bit later, but often when we have and we push back, they go, oh, okay, these guys have got some really good corporate governance, and we respect that. So we generally think we can't push back, but a lot of the time we actually can. It's just how we do it.
Okay, and then one last question, and this is from Joff. If a company is applying for credit facilities, in their credit agreement, they call for the owner to sign a surety. Can this be avoided? Um,
100% it must be avoided.
or
So
cancelled, and also can a value limit be inserted?
So you could put a value limit in it, yes, but I would always take it out. Why should you put yourself and your home and everything on the line simply because you're now signing a client agreement? I really, yeah, we always just cross out any form of surety. And no, please don't sign surety ships. It is not a requirement. Well, it is.
And then there's a question here that came in from Rebecca, who seems to be a really, really nice person. She's saying when a client's medium business is experiencing difficulties and you become human about it by understanding, what is the acceptable period for holding the unpaid invoices on record before a write-off is required?
Sure. Again, it's all about your business and your cash flow and your needs and your requirements. I mean, for some of us, it may be that if we're not paid within 7 days, we can't pay the salaries and things like that, and we could potentially be in trouble. So it's really difficult to give you an answer on that without understanding the nature of your business. But that's a decision that you're going to have to work out for yourself, unfortunately, in terms of what period is going to be something that is acceptable to you.
Okay, and then sorry, there's another question that came in from Nomsa. And I think it's around, the two different contracts for customers and for suppliers to cover yourself. What is the difference? What is the difference in the contracts?
Um, so again, if you are using a supplier, you're going to be a little bit more bolshy around the terms, because I know I'm potentially contradicting myself, but because the supplier is wanting your work and wanting your business. But a lot of the times, if we are dealing with the larger suppliers, your large IT providers, your software companies, their agreements are going to be take it or leave it, because they have, they've got loads of people that are using their services. So it depends on the supplier. I mean, it is a big difference between supplier agreements and client contracts, and it depends which side of the fence you're actually sitting on. So I know I didn't probably answer that to the best, in the best manner, but it is quite a different genre. We could do a session around those at some stage, or we can have a discussion. You can call me, please, if you have any specific questions around supplier agreements. Okay,
One
can I
last
move on?
question. I think just
Yeah.
one last question. This is now actually around liability. What
Yes.
kind of business insurance contract would you advise between indemnity and non?
Okay, are we talking insurance? So indemnity is a different kettle of fish. I didn't deal with that in terms of one of the pitfalls, but don't indemnify in terms of your agreement. So from an indemnity perspective, a lot of the clients will build in that you indemnify them against blah, 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 blah. The problem with an indemnity is that they don't then have to go and prove something. Because you've given an indemnity, it gives them a far stronger right to enforce something without having to actually go and prove it. So try and steer away from you can provide indemnities around you have the authority to enter into this agreement, you indemnify them against if you don't, etc., etc. But to indemnify them against breach or not providing an SLA is very detrimental to you. So that's the one side from an indemnity perspective. Try and steer away from indemnities in terms of an agreement. I'm not sure, Almarie, can you just repeat from an insurer perspective?
Go off mute. What kind of business insurance contract would you advise between indemnity and none?
So, sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question, but whether or not you have insurance for limitation of liability, I'm not sure that I'm understanding the question properly, but you should get professional indemnity insurance. Yeah, I'm sorry, Almarie, I'm not sure I'm understanding the question.
All right, we'll get back to that. Fulofelo, maybe you can expand on that, or we will come back to you at the end and you can go off mute and ask your question. But let's carry on for now, Renee.
Okay, perfect. So one of the very underrated clauses in an agreement is the change procedure clause. I think we see it and we skim over it and we don't necessarily understand it, but this has so many implications for us as a service provider. Basically, a change procedure clause is any modifications that can take place to your agreement after your agreement has been signed. Why this is so important is because a client will come out an RFP, for example, and will give you a whole scope, and you say, cool, this is lacquer, and you sign the agreement. Then you get onto the site, and the client whispers in your ear, listen, I know we've got this, but can you please quickly do this for me? Or can we change this way? And because we are accommodating and we want to keep the client happy, we would agree to those changes and would do whatever they're asking. And then at the end of the month, we bill them for that. And they go, no, I mean, I've been involved in some serious litigation around this in particular, where the client just comes back and says, no, actually, that wasn't contracted as part of the services. And we must remember that in one of our boilerplate clauses, we have in one of our boilerplate clauses, we have a term which says, it says the parties won't agree, nothing in this agreement can be changed other than through writing. So then the client's just going to come back and say, sorry, I don't actually owe you anything because you shouldn't actually have been providing those services because it wasn't contracted for. So it may be deemed invalid and it's definitely going to lead to disputes. So what's generally set out in a change procedure is you have a scope change document which sets out what that change is proposing, the potential impact on the fee and the time. So if you are bound by specific times or SLAs, you would then say, okay, if we're going to change this or do this, it's going to potentially delay the project by a month or two, etc., etc. Please note that either party can suggest a change to the agreement. It doesn't just have to be from the client perspective. We need to make sure in our change procedure that we have a period within which that can either be accepted or rejected. If it is accepted or rejected, the change should only be implemented after signature. And this is something that is always very difficult for you or for the service providers on the ground, is that the clients coming to you and saying, listen, we've got a crisis, we need this sorted out urgently. Then we don't have the whole time to go and sort out this change document and get it looked at and accepted. But it's very important that we make sure that we try to do so, or we at least get something in writing from your customer confirming the request for the change and that you've said to them, okay, cool, I can do this for you, but it's going to cost you X. The reasons if we don't do this is that it could have scope creep, like I mentioned a little bit earlier. It could have resource strain. So you've got two people providing the services on the ground, they're providing field services. If the client keeps changing his mind and asking you to do additional stuff, that resource on your ground is substantially burdened by more work than was originally contracted for. It can breach your milestones and your times and your SLAs, but most importantly, if we don't deal with this, it damages the relationships because, yeah, it's just, you're doing stuff for the client and the client's coming back and saying, or the client comes back and says, the person that actually asked you to do that didn't have the authority to do so. So therefore, I'm not paying you for the additional work or service. The next one is really important for you, in particular on this forum, is your intellectual property. And how do you safeguard your rights and the disclosure or the use of your IP? We need to make sure that we protect your IP in terms of your agreements. Some of the clauses that I've proposed here, and generally the norm is that either party's IP prior to the effective date of the agreement remains that party's IP. Parties understand that. Or anything that you develop outside the terms of the agreement is that party's IP. So what we need to obviously contract for is the deliverable. So now you're providing a service to your customer. What happens to the intellectual property that's created as a result of that deliverable? Please make sure that that deliverable will generally become, the IP will generally become the customer's IP. But make sure in your agreement that you have a clause which says it will only transfer to the customer upon payment. Because what happens is we reach the end of the term of our agreement and the customer says, thanks very much, this IP is mine, but you have a whole dispute around payment. This is a super way to make sure also that you get paid, is to make sure that your product deliverables IP only transfers upon receipt of payment. Another thing which is really important, you can make sure, or you should make sure, that any methodologies that you create during the course of the agreement belong to you. So while you're providing the service, you have this great light bulb moment and about a manner of work or somewhere that's going to make your life a little bit easier. Make sure that any methodology, even if it is provided in term while you're providing the service, the methodology remains yours. It then means that you could use it at all your other customers as well. The consequence if we don't protect our IP is obviously we lose our competitive advantage. It's really important for all of us on this forum that our IP, this is what the customer is looking for. It's something that we've got that other people don't necessarily have. We need to make sure that we remain competitive and we protect ourselves. We protect ourselves against the unauthorized use of it. Obviously, it also protects us then against financial losses, because the minute somebody else is using what you've got or what you've developed, you lose business. And then most importantly, it protects you against litigation, which is very, very costly, especially when you want to try and prove that this is your IP and you haven't properly contracted for it. I know this seems quite logical in terms of signature of an agreement, but I have the amount of agreements that I've seen where the parties spend months negotiating and then we just never sign it. We just continue to, we start providing the services and it's either only signed by the one party as opposed to both parties. But it's really important to make sure that we sign the agreement, because the signature of the agreement will make sure that we have a reliable terms that everybody that reflects both parties' specific interests and intent when you've got it signed. We also need to make sure that the person that's signing has the authority to sign. If you have a verbal agreement, and I think it's important for everyone to understand, a verbal agreement in our law, that's an oral agreement, is valid, but you have to have certain terms, which we're not going to go into at the moment. But it is very difficult to prove because it becomes a he said, she said scenario. What we also need to make sure we build in at the underneath your signature section is you must have the words who warrants his authority, his or her authority to sign. That means that even if you haven't got a board resolution, you haven't gone through the process of having to get one, that person has warranted that they are authorized to sign that agreement. Why that is important is because if they didn't have the authority to sign the agreement and bind the company, the warranty would be a misrepresentation. You would then be able to claim damages or some form of breach, because they are going to argue that person signed the agreement but didn't have the authority to sign. And you're going to say, I'm very sorry, but you've got a warranty which says that they had the ability or the authority to sign. Generally, for all of us on here, those people that are generally going to sign your agreements are going to be your directors of your entities or ExCo members with delegated authorities. Remember, when you delegate authority, to make sure that you've got the right board resolutions authorizing the person to do so. And then a relatively new clause in our agreements is the counter-signing clause. Not too long ago, 14, 15 years ago, we used to sign an agreement where we all used to sit around the table. We all used to pass around copies of the hard printed copies, and everybody had to be in the same room to sign an agreement. I think it's fabulous now, the fact that we have different people working in different parts of the country and the world can actually sign one agreement, which has one single binding effect. So I have proposed your counter-signing clause in the agreement, and your date of last signature would be the party signing last. So if I sign it in Joburg today and Elmarie signs it in Cape Town tomorrow, your agreement will be deemed to be signed tomorrow because it's been signed in Cape Town on the last day. In conclusion, I've got a couple of general tips that I want to share with you. And I think the first one for me is what I've touched on a little bit before, but is so profound, to remember that the customer is not your friend. And I think so often, especially when we have all the sales guys and we get all their pushback and things like that, the customer isn't your friend. The customer is there to make sure that his interests are protected in the best possible manner. You need to make sure that you push back and you make sure that you protect yourself as well. Also touched on a little bit earlier, legal governance is a subset of corporate governance. A lot of the time we think our customers are going to be annoyed by us if we're going to come with an agreement to them, or if we are going to push back on a clause. Actually, this is so not true, and we found it over and over again, because the customer goes, okay, they agree that you need to have good corporate governance. It boosts your reputation and it gives them stakeholder confidence in your company, and they want to deal with you. So bear in mind that legal is something, or your contract is something, that is not always going to be a bad thing. I think we so often think it's going to be a bad thing when we come with one to the customer. I have touched on this as well. It's really difficult to enforce verbal agreements. Please make sure that you have everything in writing so that you can avoid disputes. And then lastly, it's really important to make sure, once you have signed the agreement, that you understand what you have promised and what you are delivering to your customer. I can't personally understand it, but a lot of people feel that a legal agreement is very dull and boring, and they skim through it and then just sign it. You need to make sure that you are very aware of the SLAs that you are bound by. Make sure that you have various exclusions for scope, etc., if they don't work from you. But read your agreement. Make sure that you understand your agreement. And I think, in summary of the course today, the whole point of contracting is to make sure that you mitigate your risk. We make sure that we prevent any serious financial consequences to your business. Thanks, Elmarie. I don't know if there are any more questions.
Yes, we do have a couple, Renee. Let me just go through them. So we've got a question here from Candy. She's saying, if you supply an NPO, are you able to add interest if the invoice is not paid?
Sorry, an NPO? What? Tell me.
Yeah, non-profit organization. So if you supply a
Okay.
non-profit organization, are you able to add interest if the invoice is not paid?
I think so, but I would need to make sure. I'm happy to come back to you on that one. I think you should be able to, but I couldn't tell you that distinctly. Yeah.
Okay. And then from Garth, could change procedures not lead to variation orders placed on the supplier when the scope of work changes during the rollout of the project?
Yeah, absolutely. So a variation order is the same as a scope change order. So it just means that you have a document which documents the change and the impact. And I think a lot of the time the scope changes or you vary it, but then we don't change the fee or add an additional fee or a timeline. So yeah, a variation order and a change process order is the same.
Oh, and then Sham Gabedi had a really horrible experience. So they're asking, is change procedure similar to expansion to scope of work? And I can relate to this because one of my clients changed the project scope, but then they do not want to pay us because of the contractual agreement and the procurement clause of no PO, no work.
I know, and this is exactly what I'm saying. And so often we try to be the nice guy. The client phoned you, they said, listen, we've got this thing, we need you to quickly do it. You don't have an agreement in place, you do it, you try and get your money back. And it is, unfortunately, Elmarie, it is something that we find over and over again. And that goes to the exactly what I'm saying. Your customer's not your friend. I know we think that we're going to help them, but you know, when it comes to it, they don't want to pay you, and then you're out of pocket. So please make sure that you put everything together and that you get documented and that you don't have scope creep. And if you do, that you make sure that you have it documented some way that allows you to do so.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that in corporates, there's finance, and then there is your customer, and they are two completely different entities, and they have different uh, drivers. So even if
Absolutely.
you have a really good relationship with your customer, you have to understand that they don't have the authority to pay you. Only, finance has. So that's why it's so important that, and if you have a good relationship with your customer, you can say to them, can we just get this in writing? Can I just get a PO for this? Or can we just do this? Because otherwise, you know that I won't get paid.
And Almarie, just asking, they understand.
Mm,
And I think so often we're scared to ask. We don't
mm,
want to ruin that relationship. But actually, once we've asked, we generally get it because what we're asking is not unreasonable. And I think
mm.
it's fair, it's not unreasonable. So we just need to ask.
Yeah. We've got a question here from Daniel regarding IP protection. How would you word the protection of your methodologies used during a contract or project?
So what we would do, we would make sure that when we define IP in the front page of the agreement, that includes methodologies. So the definition of IP says your methodologies, etc., etc. But bearing in mind that those methodologies will be the methodologies that you come into the agreement with, I would go one step further and make sure that you have a clause in your agreement that says, notwithstanding any of the above, the parties agree that any methodologies created during the course of the agreement will belong to the party that created the methodology or
Mm.
something.
Could you use a WhatsApp confirmation?
Oh, no, I want to say no. Again, it's not really in writing. It doesn't really show the intent. Also, no, rather not.
So because Barry's saying that he's in facilities sphere and a lot of emergency response jobs and there's no time for contracts, but maybe there's something that you can put in place to deal with those emergencies. Maybe have like I don't know, a PO pot, like a PO that's specifically for that, or have an agreement with your customer that if it falls under these emergencies, that they will pay your invoice within 30, 15 days if it's been signed off, those kind of things.
100%. And I think what's really important is that we can put together anything that you need in terms of your business. So if you find that this is something that's happening regularly, let's put together a quick one pager which covers you in those instances that you get your
Mm,
client to sign, especially if you're experiencing a lot. We can make sure that we have, even if you've got a 2 or 3 page agreement, just have something. It doesn't need to be this horrible 50-page agreement that your client gives you,
mm,
but you can negotiate. And if you're finding that you have a problem regularly, let's fix it. It is fixable.
yeah. I think that's us for the day. Renee, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was very insightful. Loads of compliments coming in as well from people saying that it's been incredibly and you can see, all the emojis, the applause that's
Thank
coming
you.
in, and the hearts. So this has been something that people really enjoyed. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you very much for everybody that's joined us today. We know that, taking an hour out of your business it costs you money, but we're very grateful that you are making this investment. And then I'm wishing all of you a blessed weekend and take care.
Thanks, everyone. It's been a privilege. Bye.
Bye.
Oh yeah! Come on! Give me that! Come on, sugar! Woo! Come on! I'll work it.